Oh, looks like I'm live. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining another AMA Ask Me Anything. I am Steve White, CEO of RentPrep. We do tenant screening and we host an incredible Facebook community filled with landlords that submit us questions every single month. And I do my best to try to give pretty honest answers. Sometimes I don't know the answers, and I will let you know that in the event that something comes across and I don't know 100% what the answer might be. And keep in mind, most of my answers that I'm going to give come from not only my own personal experience as a landlord and managing my properties, but also almost 20 years now in screening tenants, helping landlords, taking all kinds of questions from landlords and dealing with issues that landlords come up with on a day-to-day basis. And so there's a lot of things that we've seen, a lot of issues that we've come across and watched landlords go through them. And so the premise here is you can learn from some of the other landlords' mistakes or some things that they may have done that they would have wished that they would have done differently if given the opportunity. So we will jump right in. We've got a couple of questions here, and I'll start with one from Susie. Susie asks, when collecting a security deposit from multiple people living in a unit, an unmarried couple, for instance, she says, should I be asking if each person is contributing half and making a note of that for future disputes? Or should I be impressing upon the tenants that the deposit is for the unit damage, and should one tenant move out, they need to settle the deposit disputes among themselves? It's a good question, fairly common one. I always kind of point out whenever we're talking about security deposits that for as long as I can remember, and still true to this day, the number one issue in landlord-tenant court across the country that's tracked is security deposit disputes. So it is definitely important that you take your time with it. You're pretty confident that you know what you're doing in the sense of you've got everything checked. If you're in a state that requires you to hold it into a separate account that's bearing interest, you're doing that. You're returning it within the amount of time that you're supposed to, typically 30 days. You're notating any deductions, so any damages that you're taking out of the security deposit. Obviously, if you've listened to these AMAs before, you know that I'm also a stickler when it comes to documentation. I would say that's probably the number one reason that landlords lose in court is because they don't properly document or don't do a good enough job documenting things like damages. And that could include taking pictures, notating calls, just keeping a log and keeping track of everything that happens, and especially when you're dealing with security deposits. So a couple of ways to deal with multiple people, roommate situations, and a security deposit. You can go the route of splitting the lease up and giving each person their own individual lease with their own security deposit that they're responsible for. Sometimes this is a good move if you're dealing with maybe student housing or especially roommates that don't know each other. In that case, if somebody leaves or moves out, it doesn't throw everything off, and the roommates that are left remaining aren't scrambling trying to come up with the rent and things like that, or telling you that they're not going to be able to pay the rent. You can also lump them into the same lease. So in this case, Susie had mentioned, like, it sounds like she was dealing with an unmarried couple, so they're a couple living together. Although the same things can happen there, where maybe they split up and now the person who's remaining can't afford to pay the rent on their own. So that's something that you've got to think about as well. And in those cases, usually you want to have just a single lease for both of them. And if that's the case, I would say you usually don't want to split the security deposit up. You want to make the security deposit for the lease. And so if one person leaves, the other person is still responsible to pay the rent. If there's any damages, they're going to be responsible to either pay their portion of the damages if the security deposit is not covering it, and that's usually the way that it's handled is under one lease, one security deposit. Both of them are the responsible party. If one person leaves, it doesn't let the other one off the hook. They've got to come up with the rent or figure their living situation out. And then that way you're also not splitting security deposits. It's up to the couple to decide how they're going to do it. You don't want to get dragged into those type of disputes with them. So you're holding that security deposit under that single lease agreement. If you're dealing with roommates or, multiple tenants, multiple leases, you just want to be really clear in your agreement. And usually it's a separate agreement that they're signing, like an addendum to a lease that would be a security deposit agreement, making really clear what they're paying, what happens when they leave, how much time is going to go in between when they leave and when the security deposit's paid. You want to make sure that everything is thought through and really clear. You don't want it to be something that they feel like you're holding something back, or you didn't give them enough money, or one person leaves and somebody else is holding that security deposit, or another roommate or something like that. So you're dealing with them one-to-one, each roommate between each landlord, and you're dealing with them as separate business transactions. So I think it depends on what the circumstances are, but typically unmarried couple living together, they're more than roommates, they're a couple. In that situation, that's going to be under one lease typically. If you're dealing with, again, roommates, college roommates, people who don't necessarily know each other, maybe they do. In that case, then a lot of landlords will choose to split that up. That way it doesn't completely disrupt things if somebody leaves or if they flunk out of school or something like that. So my advice, Susie, is if you're dealing with an unmarried couple, put them under that lease agreement, have a single security deposit, make it clear that the security deposit is for when the apartment turns over. If one person leaves, then that's not your issue. That's the issue between the couple. So I would recommend handling it that way. Okay, hope that was good for you, Susie. Next question I got here is from Trent. So Trent says, I just bought my first house, and I've got 2 tenants to move in while I'm living there. I had them sign a month-to-month lease from Staples. Ooh. Was this a good move? My first instinct is no, it's not a good move if it's from Staples, because it's probably a boilerplate cookie cutter lease agreement. May not have everything included in there that you want. May not be state specific. May not have thought through everything that you as the landlord, especially being an occupant, owner-occupant, may have wanted to include in that lease. So it's your first one. You definitely get a little bit of leeway there, Trent. And unfortunately, like most landlords, you're probably going to learn from experience. So I don't wish a bad experience on you, but chances are there's going to be something that comes up and you're going to say, oh, next time I'm going to make sure I include that in my lease agreement, or I'll make sure that language is included in there for that. The good news is that it's just a month-to-month lease. So you can swap that thing out, get a new one in place. My advice anytime in dealing with leases is try to think everything through. I don't want this to be taken the wrong way. Some landlords might, but keep in mind that almost anything that you put on a lease agreement, and if they're signing, they're agreeing to it. It's got to be lawful, obviously, but and within reason. But I would say don't be afraid to put things in there that would not work for, the house next door. Make it very specific to that property. And especially if you're an owner occupant, you got to consider that you're going to be living there and having to share space with people, or at least, some shared space with people. So think of those things. If it's smoking, if there's no smoking, if you're allowing smoking, where are they allowed to smoke? Where do they have to put their cigarette butts? If they're having people over, how long are those people allowed to stay over if they're going to be overnight guests? These are all things that you can build into the lease that, again, are usually really specific to the property, specific to you as the landlord, and what your either concerns are or what your tolerances are. Unfortunately, I don't think that, those staples leases or leases that you can, grab somewhere that's sort of a boilerplate, works for everywhere type of thing, is usually going to cut it long term. So as soon as you get an opportunity to get them off of the staples month to month, I would recommend doing that. And again, put some thought to, what you really want in that lease and what you want to protect yourself from. And again, there's no limit to the amount of addendums you can throw on there. Keep in mind, too, that there's sort of the other side to that coin is that, this is still somewhat of a sales process. You still want to attract tenants. And one of the surefire ways to scare tenants away is to throw a, 50-page lease on the table and tell them they're going to have to sign an initial as if they're purchasing a home. So you don't want to make it, so crazy that it's going to scare people away, but make sure that you're putting, the important things in there. And my recommendation would be check out rentprep.com. We've got a ton of articles and resources on lease agreements, addendums, things that you want to add in there, and really give it some thought before you have them sign a new lease that includes all things and everything. So, good question from Trent. I'm pretty sure I may have gotten my first lease agreement from not Staples, but I think it was Office Depot at the time. So similar, same. I get it. It's out there. You're just trying to make it work. But again, if you had a chance to do it over, which you will in a month, I would do it over and make sure that you got a rock solid, Loctite lease in place that protects you. All right. Hope that helps, Trent. Next question we've got here is from Rose. So hang on, let me just swap that. All right. Rose asks, how do I screen a person who does not have a social security card, only a passport from another country? It's a good question. It's right in my wheelhouse, Rose. I'm super comfortable answering this one. This is what we do here at RentPrep, screen tenants. It's not uncommon whatsoever to screen tenants that don't have social security numbers or have recently issued social security numbers. So, this isn't uncommon at all. So, a couple of things. Without a social security card, people typically have, if they're living in the country, they have what's called a TIN number. And a lot of, even the credit bureaus now are able to pull data using a TIN number. There may not be anything to pull, maybe a pretty boring report, which ultimately for landlords is good. They want boring reports. That usually means the person doesn't have, a lengthy history of issues, at least. You're not going to get any good information on there, like, credit information and things like that. But, at least that they don't have a lengthy record of evictions or violent crimes and things like that. Not many companies will accommodate the way that RentPrep can, because we do screening in-house and we use actual live screeners. So you can also order or place an order for a background check and put zeros in for the Social Security number. We recognize that as you either don't have the number, the person doesn't have a number, or they refuse to give you the number. In any event, we will dig around and try to find either the correct number or confirm that they don't, in fact, have a Social Security number. So it's not uncommon. Chances are it's going to be, again, pretty boring report, depending on what you're looking at. If it's credit, probably going to be real boring. Not much information that you're going to be able to see on there, but you for sure want to do your due diligence and make sure that they don't have a history of evictions or judgments against them. And that, I would say, is also not that uncommon. We've definitely seen our share of that, where you've got somebody who is in the country legally or illegally, don't have a Social Security number. They get evicted. It's a court record. We'll still be able to find it using, name, address matches, things like that. And so you for sure want to be checking that and doing your due diligence, again, just to make sure that there's nothing there. But it can be done. It can be done here at RentPrep. If you're using a lot of other services that just automate everything, you try to put zeros in, it's probably going to kick it back and say error, or it's invalid, or you can't do it. And if it's automated, then it's only going to retrieve information that it has or that it knows. So a company like RentPrep is going to be exactly what you want for these exact situations, where you might have to dig a little bit deeper, run additional searches beyond just a Social Security number search. We're going to look for, name matches, address history of evictions at the address where that person was or still currently is. So those usually require a little bit of a deeper dive. So don't panic, Rose. Doesn't mean you can't screen them. You still can and should. You just got to be aware of how you're doing that screening and who's doing it for you. So if you run into it, give us a call or live chat us or email screening@rentprep.com. Screener will walk you through exactly how to pull this off without a Social Security number. So I hope that helps. All right. Next question I've got is from Trinell. Trinell says, I've got a tenant in Ohio I gave a 30 days notice to. The tenant's on Section 8. It goes into effect in a couple of days. What's the next step if they don't leave? Non-renewal notice? No, not a non-renewal notice. So if you give a 30-day notice, it's gonna go into effect in a couple of days, I'm assuming, meaning that you gave this notice 30 days ago, and the non-renewal should have been with that 30-day notice. So if the 30-day notice is a notice for them to vacate and that you're not going to be renewing the lease, then that 30-day notice is the non-renewal notice. If there's no other detail in the question, so I don't know if it was a situation where it's a pay or quit notice if they stop paying, or if it's an eviction situation where maybe they're violating the terms of the lease in some way, and so you want them out. In that case, it wouldn't be a non-renewal notice. But typically a 30-day notice is exactly that. Notice that it's, you're not renewing the lease, and upon the end of the lease, they've got to vacate the property. So that depends on the situation, Trinell, I would say. If it's just simply, you're not renewing the lease agreement, you want them out at the end of the lease term, in that case, that 30-day notice that you gave is the notice of non-renewal. If it's a different situation where it's an eviction, then that's a little bit of a different story there. So in that case, you're going to get notice to pay or quit usually, or notice to vacate, or forcible entry and detainer, depending on where you are, or which state in which filing is appropriate for you. But those are handled two different ways. So it depends on if it's an eviction or if it's just we're not renewing your lease term. The only thing I would warn you, I'm not 100% sure in Ohio. I know in New York, there are different time periods based on how long that person has been a tenant. So, for example, in New York State, if it's 2 years or more that they've been a tenant and a resident of that property and occupying that property, you've got to give them at least a 90-day notice for non-renewal. So just be aware that, in some states, they do have, timing guidance based on how long that person was a tenant or occupant of that property. So just keep that in mind. Nothing jumps out at me for Ohio, but especially with COVID, things have definitely been changing. In New York State, that was pushed through as a COVID CARES Act legislation. So could very well be the same in Ohio. So be aware there, Trinell, and hope that answers your question. If not, I would say definitely reach out, give me a little bit more detail on exactly what's happening there, and I can try to point you in the right direction as best as I can. Okay. Next question I've got is from Tom. So Tom says, I notified an applicant that they got our rental. I want to sign the lease as soon as possible so I can take down the listing and stop showing it. The tenant keeps putting off the signing. Any advice? I have other applicants, but their credit score isn't good. I need someone in there ASAP. Understandable. Well, as landlords, we obviously want to fill those vacancies and stop eating that full cost of the mortgage and start to cash flow a little bit. So I get it. I would say you got to put a time frame on this stuff, especially if you want to have them signed by the 1st. Today's the 31st, so they don't have very much time. You want to put a time frame on that and tell them, I've got to have this thing back by the 31st at 5, or I've got a line of other people here. You as the landlord, you don't have to hold this just because they said they're interested or they want it. And chances are, if they're dragging their feet on it, there's usually a pretty good explanation for it that they may not be sharing with you, but they might be holding out for something else that they've applied to, and that's maybe their first choice, and you're the backup, and so they're waiting to hear if they're going to get that other place. And if that's the case, then they're going to leave you hanging. If they're scrambling, trying to come up with the security deposit, that's another reason that we see a lot of times that these things take a little bit longer than the landlord wants them to. And as the landlord, that should be concerning. If they're having trouble coming up with the security deposit money, it's not usually a good sign that they're going to be timely with the rent every month either. So I would keep really good communication. I'd hold them to a date. I'd give them a deadline. And the next piece of my advice here is going to be critical for you, Tom. You don't want to choose the least worst out of the pool of applicants. So it sounds to me like you want to you want to get some other applicants in there, because if this person, doesn't come through for you, then you're going to be stuck picking somebody that would not have been your first choice. And again, it sounds like they're basically the least worst out of the bunch. So you're about to be faced with a real test of will for a lot of landlords, which is, are you willing to let your property sit vacant out of principle, that you're not going to let somebody in there that is going to make things difficult for you? And I will tell you right now, as painful as that might seem, and as much as you might hate the idea of it, I promise you it's the right move in every situation I've ever seen. Don't make a bad move out of desperation. Wait the month. I promise you it'll be worth it. Keep the listing up. Keep gathering applicants and applications. Keep screening. Don't settle for somebody that wouldn't have been a legitimate choice for you just because it's, coming down to crunch time and now it's a desperate decision. So a lot of landlords get themselves into trouble that way. Most of them that I talk to usually end up regretting that, and if had the chance to do it over, would have let the property sit vacant. I've told the story on AMAs in the past, so I'll share it one more time for the sake of you, Tom. I let my property sit for 5 months before I put a tenant in it, and partially because I own a tenant screening company. I thought it's going to be a really bad look if I put the wrong tenant in here, but that just goes to show you that, I was being picky. Not that it was a bad property necessarily, but it was a single family home, and it wasn't a super desirable neighborhood, and so it just sort of met the criteria for this weird scenario of where I just didn't get any qualified applicants for a long time. And believe me, there was many times where I almost made a bad decision, and thankfully I waited, and knock on wood, I've got a long-term tenant in there. They're great. Didn't even pay late once throughout the whole pandemic. They take good care of the property. They're awesome. Ask me several years later if that was the right decision, and I will tell you 100% that was the right decision. If I would have rushed and just put somebody in there for the sake of wanting to fill the vacancy as fast as possible, I would have for sure, opened myself up to some sort of possible potential nightmare. So, hope that helps, Tom. Be picky, be patient. Next question I've got here is from Linda. So thanks for chatting in, Linda, and asking your question. So what's the best way to verify my applicant's income? It's a great question. There's a difference between employment verification and income verification. So employment verification, we hit a lot of dead ends here. And for a couple of years now, we have not carried an employment verification product because they're not super useful. We would call employers, ask obvious questions like, how much do they make? How long they've been working there? And over time, I have seen less and less employers willing to give up that information easily, even with the signed consent or the disclosure from the application saying that, that the tenant is allowing their employer to give information. So employing or verifying employment is not always the best answer, and verifying income is usually the better route, because especially we're living in the days of, this gig economy and the side hustle and people, making extra income all kinds of different ways. And it's not always W-2 income. It's not always something that we're going to be able to call an employer, you're going to be able to call an employer, or they're going to be able to give you paychecks. So my advice for verifying the applicant's income is bank statements. Bank statements tell the real story. If you're looking at how much is deposited, and you're typically looking at that on a 6-month or a 90-day average. So you want to make sure you're watching out for windfalls. You're watching out for, a large sum that comes in, randomly, or something that's not, frequent, or, something that they're not going to be able to count on in the future confidently. And bank statements are typically the best way to do that. Shameless self-promotion here, and you can get it other places as well, but we've got a really good product. It's an income verification product by the Closing Docs. It's available on RentPrep.com, and it's a non-invasive way for applicants to share their bank information with you. Instead of them having to print out, 90 days worth of bank statements, or give you access to their bank account, which I don't imagine anybody in their right mind doing, but I've heard stories of landlords asking for it. So what this product does is that it electronically connects to their bank account, scrapes the deposit information, puts it into a tidy, neat little report for you that says, here's their 90-day average, here's the past 30 days, what it looks like, and that will give you a really good insight into what their real income actually is. So that's my best advice. Use a third party. If they're printing bank statements, they can obviously be altered. We've seen people alter bank statements, paychecks, credit reports. It's too easy to do it these days, and you do not have to be super savvy to pull it off. You don't have to be a whiz on Photoshop or anything like that. All you got to know how to do is convert a PDF into a Word document, change something, print it, or save it again as a PDF and send it off. It's too easy to change information. So I would say make sure it's coming from a third party, and again, verifying income versus employment. And so our product on RentPrep.com works really well, and I'm sure there's a few others out there that'll do the same, but you want it to be an electronic income verification. So hope that helps, Linda. Check out RentPrep.com. It's a $10 add-on, and it's well worth the $10 to be able to get a snapshot of what their actual income really is. All right. Next question I've got is from Kathy. So Kathy says, our tenant texted us today asking if we would accept rental assistance. I think that they mean Section 8. Do we have a legal responsibility to accept rental assistance? They have a few more months on their lease. So you do have a legal responsibility to accept all legal sources of income, and this falls under it. So you can be picky when you're screening, and especially if you're in a state that has some Section 8 restrictions, and you can sort of choose whether you want to participate or not. But if you've got a tenant there already, and they're going to apply for rental assistance, and if they're going to get it, you have to accept that if they're an existing tenant. So that's an acceptable legal source of income. It's actually, I believe it's a protected class now, or falls under like a protected class under fair housing. So you want to be sure that you don't say anything that's going to get you into legal trouble there. You don't want to say, no, you don't participate, or you're going to have to move out, find another place to live. That is, that's legal source of income for them. So you've got to accommodate if they're an existing tenant there already. They've got a few months on the lease. Chances are, I don't know again what state that you're in, but I know in New York State where I'm at, there is a very lengthy list to start receiving Section 8. And I've never heard of anybody, say that they wanted Section 8 and a month later they had it. It's usually sometimes years that they're on this waiting list to be able to be accepted into the program. Most states limit how many vouchers they can give out. So if there's a finite number of vouchers, that means there's going to be a waiting list. It's not something that they're just going to dole out to everybody as they apply. So my gut would tell me, if they, if they're telling you this now and there's a couple more months on the lease, there's a really good chance that that you're not going to have to. However, I would say you should absolutely consider it. It's I'm not going to say it's easy money, but it's guaranteed money. You're at least getting a portion of it from a third party. They pay right as rain. You're not going to have to chase them down or hunt them down and ask for your rent check, or at least their portion of the rent check. You've got a third party sort of mediator in there if things do go wrong or go sideways. So if the tenant stops paying their portion, you can immediately reach out to their Section 8 person that's assigned to them, caseworker or whatever. And so, it does give you maybe a little bit more teeth than you typically would have if you're just dealing with that tenant one-to-one. On the flip side of that, there's some restrictions in terms of, or I should say, requirements that you've got to make sure that you're providing, or that you're keeping the place up to a certain standard, that when the state comes in to do their inspection, that everything is on the up and up. If you're keeping a good rental property, this shouldn't be a huge concern. I've obviously, there's horror stories out there of, silly things that inspectors will fail landlords for, but I really feel like that most people, if they're keeping a good place, everything's in good order, that you should be fine when that inspector comes out. And if you're not, usually the list of things that they want you to correct are usually pretty simple. They're usually not anything crazy. Again, assuming the place is already in pretty good order. So my personal take on that is, I wouldn't mind if they were a good tenant already, and they started to get assistance just to ensure that rent's still showing up every month on time when it should. I'm okay with it. So that's my personal opinion. Kathy, you may have a different take or another reason, but I think the important thing here is to make sure that you do not tell your tenant no, that you won't accept the housing assistance. All right. Next question I've got is from Carol. So Carol asks, our properties are in areas where most people do not have great credit. For those situations, what do you ask for to accept applicants? Additional security deposits. So, believe it or not, Carol, your area may not be as isolated or special as you might think. This is not uncommon at all. And matter of fact, year over year, whenever we survey our clients, we're always sort of stunned, I should say, that half of our clients think credit is super important, and the other half don't think that it's important at all. And so it really is sort of like this philosophical difference between landlords that we've noticed, where like they're all in on credit or all out on credit. They just love it or hate it. And I get it, and I've heard both sides of it. I've heard landlords say, I expect my renters to not have good credit. If they had good credit, they'd own homes. They're not wrong. Obviously not for every situation, but I get the thought process at least there. And then on the other side, I've heard people say, credit's important to understand the person's payment history. And it's a good, test of their character, which is what tenant screening is all about, is really your you're judging somebody's character that you don't know. And so you're using what I always call the magic formula, which is, 2 parts data and 1 part gut feeling. You don't want to ignore that gut feeling that you get, but you don't want to base your decisions purely on that. Um, so, so my advice for you specifically, Carol, if credit is off the table, and if they don't have great credit, um, first thing I would lean to is, what does their rental history look like? So, some people with bad credit are good at prioritizing their bills still. And as we all know, housing should be pretty high, if not the highest on the top of your priority list. And sometimes that means that you've got to make some sacrifices. And so it's not crazy at all to see situations where you've got a really good renter with bad credit and they've paid their rent on time. And sometimes the cost of doing that might be they sacrifice a credit card bill or paying the dentist off or something like that. So, as a landlord, that's at least a little bit less scary. So rental history is super important in that situation. Um, Even if they've got bad credit, it's still not a bad idea to look at the credit, understand why it's bad, understand if it's bad because of a specific time in their life. That's not unreasonable at all. We see it a lot of times in divorces. There's, a lot of times where there's information that doesn't look great, but there's an explanation for it. And if that's the case, and you're showing good history after that event that may have caused them to have bad credit, then that's a little bit less of a concern. If they don't have good credit because they're young and they just have, what we call thin file or just not a lot of credit history, then, you may want to consider having a cosigner or, a guarantor, somebody that's going to, vouch for them. Or you may say, well, they're still young. They've got a good history from the information that I can see. It's just not a lengthy history, so that's why their credit's not great. And so you may be willing to accept it. So I would say don't give them a pass necessarily on running the credit if credit's important to you, even if you understand that it's not great credit. I'd still run it, and make sure that you're clear with them if that's the case, that you're going to be looking for certain or specific things outside of just a credit score. You're going to be looking at their payment history. You're going to be looking at periods of time where maybe they lapsed on that payment history. You're going to be looking at collection accounts. You're going to be looking at histories of bankruptcies to see if this is sort of a perpetual thing that they're doing every time that they're that they're legally allowed to file bankruptcy, and then just start the process over and file another bankruptcy. On the fence, you can skip the credit. Don't skip a good, thorough background check, though. Make sure you're checking for evictions. Make sure you're checking for judgments and liens. Those things are not available on credit reports anymore, so you wouldn't get that information from a credit report anyway. But judgments and liens are going to tell a good story as well in terms of, have they stiffed a landlord in the past and abandoned a property without paying, or had to be evicted and incurred a bunch of damages and didn't pay, and now that judgment stuck to them. So do the thorough background check at the very least. If you're going to gather credit, understand what you're looking for. Score doesn't always mean everything. So person could have some good credit history without having a great credit score still. So I would say, it's a personal choice for you, Carol, whether or not credit is still important or not. If it's not, go for the super thorough background check, and make sure that you are getting super solid previous tenancy history, calling their past landlords, If you can go too deep, that's great. Their current and their previous, that would be awesome. But don't skip any steps, and I would say don't don't let something slide just because they say I don't have good credit, and now you're just sort of stuck making a gut decision, and that's for sure where mistakes hide, is in that gut decision. All right, hope that answers your question, Carol. All right, another question here from Janine. So if somebody's co-signing for a renter, what is the income requirement? I can't remember. She says, the renter should have 3 times the rent amount, but the co-signer needs far more. What do you require? Well, I would say the way that you're posing the question makes it sound like the co-signer is paying for the full rent amount. And if that's the case, then it's still 3 times. On top of, any other debts that they might have, or payment obligations that they might have. So you want to make sure that there's tons of cushion there. If they're paying for that person's rent and they have a mortgage, there's got to be that much more income cushion. So they're going to have really high income, obviously. Now, that's typically not the case. Usually a cosigner is somebody who is vouching for someone else, or they're a payment guarantor. So if that person stops paying the rent, then the cosigner ends up becoming responsible to pay the rent. It doesn't mean that they're going to pay the rent every month for that person. I would say that's actually pretty rare if that's the case. So, for a cosigner, you want to make sure that they're financially sound, and you want to make sure that if they're not paying the full rent amount, that they've at least got a good history behind them. You're not looking at it as a income to rent ratio at that point, because again, they're not responsible to pay the rent every single month. That person who's actually signing the lease agreement is going to be the one paying for it. That cosigner is just sort of a safety net in case things go wrong. And if they do go wrong, they're going to usually pick up what's owed or what's remaining, but not carry on, the life of that lease in perpetuity. So again, sort of two different things happening here. One is cosigner signs for somebody who's going to be paying for their own rent, and that cosigner is vouching and saying they're good. I trust them. If they don't pay, I'll pay you. And then the other situation is that person's not paying at all, and just the cosigner is. So if that's the case, you're treating it differently. That cosigner has to be financially able to pay that additional rent in addition or on top of what they're already paying for in their own lives. So, again, I'm not sure 100% what that situation is, but it's 2 very different scenarios there. So I hope that helps, Janine. My advice is probably most important out of all of this: make sure that your cosigner agreement has language in there about being a financial guarantor. That's an important piece. They're not just vouching, saying as like a reference, saying, yeah, this person's a good person and they should pay the rent and you should have no problems. They're actually, they're putting their neck out there. They've got a little skin in the game now at this point, that if that person doesn't pay, they're financially responsible to pay. And that changes it up a little bit. So just make sure. I've seen cosigner applications before that have nothing in there at all about being a financial guarantor. So just make sure that if that's the situation, you want a financial guarantor, not just a cosigner. So hope that helps. Sorry if it was confusing, Janine. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to help walk you through however I can. And we've got some cosigner agreements that do include the correct language that we can share with you as well. If you search rentprep.com, you should be able to find them on there also. But again, if you need help, let us know, and we'll help walk you through it. All right, next question I've got is from Shelly. So Shelly says, what's your best practice for setting up viewings for multiple interested parties that don't get weeded out in the pre-screening process? So, viewings for multiple interested parties. So this could be a question of how do you set up individual showings for each of these interested parties, or do you do kind of like a group showing? And I would say maybe not right now in COVID, in COVID times, but group showings or open house type of showings have sort of been the new fashion for landlords that really appreciate that, because they're not showing up and getting stiffed on appointments, rushing to the rental property after work to open the door, only to have the people not show up that said they were going to. And so a lot of landlords just have a open showing on a Sunday between 12 and 3 or whatever, and they're there from that time, and people show up during that time. So I would say that would be my preferred if I had multiple viewings, because my concern would be I'm going to waste my time. If I've got 3 viewings scheduled, at least one of them is not going to show, and that's wasting my time. So there's a couple of things you can do to sort of curb that a little bit. I love the idea of making them text you that day or call you that day to confirm that they're coming. You can always text them an hour beforehand and just confirm, are you still coming here? I'm on my way. I'll meet you there. And that'll reduce some of those no-shows. But, if you've got a handful of interested people and you're considering setting up a bunch of viewings, my advice would be just to limit your risk of wasting your time. Try to set it up on a day where you have a stretch of time. Maybe it's an evening, and you tell people, come between 5 and 7 on a Wednesday night, or 1 and 3 on a Sunday afternoon. And that at least limits the potential that somebody's going to stiff you on this. Otherwise, you're likely to be bouncing back and forth quite a bit. So I hope that helps. All right. Next question I've got is for Will. So Will asks, how many years does a background check go? I have a tenant who I know has had evictions in the past, but not sure how many. So it's a great question, Will. Again, right in my wheelhouse. I'm pretty confident on this one. Typically, the magic number for most pieces of information that you're going to find in a background check is 7 years. And that goes for how long does a missed payment last on your credit report? 7 years. How long is an eviction reportable for? 7 years. How long is a misdemeanor conviction or an arrest reportable for? 7 years. There are some things that break that 7-year rule. Like, for example, a bankruptcy is reportable for 10 years. A felony conviction in most states is reportable forever, for life. And in some states, unfortunately, evictions are limited to 5 years. Some municipalities, so for example, Portland has a 5-year eviction limitation. And so it would be important to know where you are, and if you're in a state or in a municipality that has restrictions on reporting periods for specifically evictions. Now, chances are, I would assume just by sheer statistics, that you're likely in an area that it's a 7-year window. That is the majority by far. The exceptions are at least not yet becoming to the point where it's in most places. So, I would say it's safe to say that typically 7 years is going to be how far back the background check goes. And the only way that it's going to not show up on the background check within that 7 years is if it was vacated. That means the court has thrown it out, or the plaintiff, so in this case it would be the landlord of the property management company, has just abandoned the case or dropped the case, or maybe they filed it incorrectly. That's usually what we're seeing in terms of what's vacated, and those are not reportable, so those aren't going to show up. We see them, but we know that if it says vacated, we can't put it on the screening report, and you can't use it against them. So that's why we would obviously leave that off. So, yeah, so 7 years, that's how far back they're gonna go typically. And again, if you're using RentPrep, call us if you run somebody and you feel like something should have been on there and maybe it didn't show up, or not as many as you thought were supposed to be on there. You talk to a screener. If we ran the report, we might be able to give you some additional insight there, additional details on maybe why something is not showing up potentially. But typically, if it's within that 7-year period, it's gonna show up on the report. So I hope that answers your question, Will. I think this is going to be our last one from Cheryl. So Cheryl asks, my tenant's going to sign a new 6-month lease on September 1st. They've been my tenants for 2 years, and I've never done an inspection. Oh, no. The rental is on our property, not too far from our house. Can I send them a text to inspect, or do I need to send an official letter? I understand they need a 24-hour notice to inspect. So, yeah. So first things first, Cheryl, get in there as soon as possible. I am a big advocate of inspecting your property at least once a year. If not you, having a third party or somebody go in there and do the inspection. Changing out air filters is always a good reason to get in there. Doing just a home inspection, a maintenance inspection, checking to make sure that, the it's not leaking under the sink, making sure that the toilet's not running continuously, making sure that, all of your appliances and things like that are operating the way that they should and everything is safe. So it doesn't always have to be an inspection based on the premise that you don't trust what they're doing or you're concerned that they're wrecking your property. It could be a genuine care and an interest in making sure that they've got a great property to rent from. So, don't hesitate to get in there because you think it's intrusive. It's not. It only is if you're making it feel that way. But if you go in there, especially with like a checklist, an inspection checklist, and you're, going around and making sure you're checking those things that are known to be issues in any home, like a running toilet or leaky plumbing and stuff like that, changing out air filters, then it's going to feel a lot less invasive than you saying, hey, it's been 2 years. I don't know what kind of damage you guys have done or, which animals are peeing on the carpet, but I want to look around. So I think how you present it is going to go a long way. Now, in terms of giving proper notice, most states will allow you to give a 24-hour notice by text, email, whatever your normal mode of communication with them is. And since you mentioned text, that would be considered the normal mode of communication. So if you typically text them and that's how you guys communicate and they text you back, you can text them and say, hey, I got to get in to inspect the property or do a walkthrough, change your air filter, make sure the plumbing is good, minimally invasive. I'll be in 15 minutes in and out. Do you have, does tomorrow or the next day work for you at this time? But it doesn't have to be, an official letter. Now, if they don't respond to you and give you the all clear, that's when you start moving to an official letter or putting it and posting it on the door and letting them know. And in that case, you would say, in 24 hours, we're going to enter the property, unless we hear from you otherwise. And in that way, you're doing your due diligence to give proper notice if they're not communicating with you. But if their normal mode of communication is text, email, phone call, then there's no issues, especially if it's text and you've got proof that they said cool, no problem. Then you should be good to go. Yeah, get in there, Cheryl. Don't let that go too long. 2 years makes me uncomfortable in terms of not seeing what's going on in there, because a lot of damage can accumulate in 2 years, and it will get worse as more time goes on. So you want to make sure you're seeing what's going on and stop anything if there is damage being done, and maybe it's something that they're not even aware of. At my property, I had a leaky roof. Had no idea that it was leaking for a long time, and finally kind of broke through, and during a real heavy rainstorm that we had. I don't know if doing 6 months inspections versus 1 year inspections would have made any bit of difference, but houses have issues. It happens. It's not crazy that you would check that stuff out. Think about it in your own house. Have you gone 2 years without going in the basement or checking to see if the toilet's running, or things that you would notice and take care of right away? So same thing. Somebody's got to be at the wheel there to make sure that they're in control, and that's you as the landlord to make sure that the property is in good working order. Everything is maintained. So inspections are not crazy, and you shouldn't feel weird about them at all. So I hope that answers your question, Cheryl. Shoot them a text if that's how you're communicating. Let them know. If they don't respond, now you go to the official posted notices on the doors and things like that. All right. That wraps up another month's AMA. I appreciate everybody who has submitted their questions or chatted in, and appreciate Ashley, our marketing coordinator, who helps set all this stuff up. Thanks, Ashley, for, again, doing a great job and getting this stuff posted over onto YouTube, getting it on our Facebook group. And any questions that you guys have, follow-ups or additional questions, feel free to reach out. Screening at rentprep.com or Steve at rentprep.com. And we'll make sure somebody gets back to you, or if I get back to you, try and point in the right direction and help you as best we can. So happy landlording, and we will see you guys next time.